Well, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk today about a topic I'm fairly passionate about, which is collecting modern issues after the war, mostly if in the context of British Commonwealth, Queen Elizabethan material from the time of the coronation and up. Um, I have always been of the opinion that you can challenge yourself quite considerably with just the modern issues. I know a lot of attention is usually paid um, to the classic material, and there's certainly no shortage of good material to collect there. But I think the modern material often gets overlooked. And the main reason is because I think most of it is fairly common. That's not at debate there. I mean, the majority of it is very attainable, but if you get into the nuances of paper and ink and constant varieties and various things, there's always that last 5 to 10% that is very elusive and very difficult to find. Um, and I think that's what can keep you really challenged and motivated throughout your collecting lifetime. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to guide you through um, my thinking on this as it relates to Canadian stamps. I will throw in as they're appropriate, but you can take my framework here and you can apply it to pretty well any modern country. Different aspects, of course, will be applicable to different countries, and some to more of an extent than others. But the general theme of what I'm talking about here should apply to pretty well any country you're collecting. So what I'm going to do is share my screen now. You'll see I've got a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll take you through the slides. And then at the end, we'll open it up for comments and questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to share screen. Good. So now, okay, so I'm going to talk a little about the appeal of modern stamps. So for me, a very major part of the appeal is you've got a balance of the challenge of acquisition with affordability. So in the classic period, most of the stamps are so well known and so well documented that all the elusive stuff is already very expensive, and it's priced accordingly. With modern stamps, there's still a lot that has not been studied, and so you have the opportunity to make discoveries and find elusive paper types or tagging types or things of that nature and not pay anywhere near what their scarcity should reflect. The other thing is, I find that modern issues are actually quite hard to identify correctly, and you need a lot of skill. It's not an area for the faint of heart or the inexperienced if you're getting into it in detail. The variations are discrete and limited. Okay, they all have significance. Um, Opportunity for almost unlimited new discoveries. The other thing is that in terms of multiples, almost all the key multiples are still intact and you can acquire them. So, one of the disadvantages with classic philately is there are many areas that you cannot completely study because the multiples required to settle certain questions from a philatelic perspective, they just don't exist anymore. And so you're left with conjecture in most cases. But with modern philately, you can actually seek out and still acquire most issues in full sheets. It's getting harder and harder naturally, but um, for the most part, it's still available. And then the last area where I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity is in the postal history. And the reason for that is we've got near annual rate increases, certainly since the 1980s for most countries. There's been different services. I know within Canada, we've had a lot of services that have been brought in, short lived, discontinued, and then replaced with something else. And all of those have a postage rate attached. And, there's an opportunity to collect covers from those rates. The other thing is the invention of setenant printing and setenant issues since about the 1970s has created um, a lot of scarcity around those issues in terms of genuine postal use, because at least in Canada, most of the setenants don't actually correspond with a specific postage rate. So trying to find them properly used on a cover is very, very difficult. And I would say that if you really want to challenge and you have a lot of money and you want to challenge yourself, try getting all the souvenir sheets and all the setenants on a proper registered cover from the time period when they were issued. Even with all the money in the world, you're not going to find them all. It's going to be very, very, very difficult. So that's an example of how the scarcity just does not correspond at all with what it would cost to acquire the items. So that leads me into a discussion of classic versus modern philately. Now, to me, these are two different disciplines. And I think one of the mistakes people often make is that they try to compare one to the other, and they sort of put classic philately up on a pedestal, but and then denigrate modern philately. But the truth is, to me, they're completely different because they focus on different things. Classic philately tends to focus on varieties that arose due to technological limitations. So, most shades in the classic period are not deliberate. They're the result of chemical differences in the inks just caused by inexactitude in measuring out the components that went into the recipes. Oftentimes, it's simply a matter of the printer not matching the ink back to the master swatch, and just getting little bits of variation with each printing until by the time they've had the 20th or 30th printing, they're way off from the earliest shade. Um, Re-entries and repairs on plates, that's simply a function of the fact that the plates were not durable when they were first produced, and they wore, and they had to be reworked. Um, you know, whereas in the modern period, everything is much more durable, doesn't wear as much, and it you get a lot more stamps printed with a lot less um, evidence of anything going wrong. Um, so most varieties are quite obvious to the naked eye in classic philately, I find. Even plate flaws, usually you can see the majority of them without a magnifying glass. Modern philately, by contrast, is the study of variations that arise from deliberate decisions made to experiment with papers, taggants, and inks, largely in order to mechanize the sorting and canceling process for mail and increase efficiency in production. So all phosphor tagging or fluorescent tagging, that's all introduced to mechanize the sorting process and to cut down on the labor required to sort and cancel letters. And that all starts in the 1950s and 60s around the world. So Great Britain has it, Canada has it as well. And in fact, the Canadian varieties arose from the trials conducted in England during the Wilding period. Um, so the varieties are that are found in modern stamps, they're a lot more subtle, but they do have a significance in that they tend to arise from an actual deliberate decision made to make certain changes to the papers and inks. Okay. most varieties that are significant in modern philately are either not readily visible to the naked eye, requiring ultraviolet light, or a lot of times you need to have a 10 power loop to see them. And so the fact that they're not readily visible does not diminish their significance. It's simply a function of the fact that modern printing is incredibly precise. I mean, everything now is done by computer, colors are mixed by computer, and they're perfect reproductions. So, I mean, with classic stamps, in Canada, we have the small queens, number 37 and 41, the 3 cent small queen, the most common Queen Victorian stamp. In England, you'll have the penny red from the same time period. And I mean, you could sort a pile of 1,000 penny reds or 1,000 small queens, and you'll wind up with probably 100 different shades. You know, if you have enough stamps, due to very tiny variations that are just a function of things like the humidity in the plant at the time the ink was mixed. With modern stamps, you can have 1,000 stamps and you might sort them and only get 2 or 3 different varieties. And you'll find that probably 950 of them will all be one. And you'll get just a handful of the other variations, if you get anything at all. Quite often you'll go through 1,000 stamps and they're identical in every way. So, you know, modern varieties, like I said before, if they're on classic stamps, a lot of them would be considered small or insignificant and too insignificant to list, which I believe is why they're not listed in the modern catalogs for the modern issues, because I think the editors of those catalogs are using the same standards to apply to the modern stamps that they're applying to classic stamps. And because I think these are different disciplines, they're getting it wrong. And they're not listing a lot of things that are actually quite significant. Um, so now we'll talk a little bit about the areas of interest in modern philately. So for Canada, we've got paper fluorescence and paper types, um, tagging and fluorescent coatings, the type of gum. So in Canada, we had a dextrin gum, as most countries did in the 50s, which eventually got replaced with PVA. And in between, we had some experimental gums like a Davic gum, which was invisible, and it looked like the stamp had no gum. But it's actually a very invisible gum. It wasn't very good. It didn't stick very well, and it didn't last for more than a couple of issues. And then we had a hybrid type of almost dextrin slash PVA gum, which we had for just a couple of years, which also didn't last. Constant varieties. So those are varieties on the sheet that occur on certain stamps, and they always occur in the same position on the sheet. And sometimes they're on every sheet, and other times they're on every second or third sheet or fifth sheet in a particular interval. Postal history, correct in-period use of satenants and souvenir sheets. Also new materials for stamps, cloth, plastic. So I know for Canada, we've had a Canadian flag stamp printed on fabric. We've had some of our self-adhesives now are basically plastic. Not too many, but we've had a few. I haven't kept up to date with Great Britain, so I don't know if you folks have had um, any alternate materials as yet. But I know other countries have. I mean, we've had porcelain stamps, we've had cloth stamps from some of the European countries. I think Switzerland had one on chocolate, and a number of other things. Self-adhesives in Canada, you get different die cutting varieties. So this would be the self-adhesive equivalent of perfs. And again, I'm only aware of self-adhesives for in England for the Masons, Post and Goes, and I think the Smilers as well. And there may be varieties there. I don't know because I'm not familiar enough with those issues, but I would assume that if you got into them, you'd probably find that those exist. Um, Perforation varieties on modern stamps. For Canada, there's a whole period starting in about the 1980s where the post office releases unannounced perforation changes. Many of them got used up before anybody realized what they were, and now they're some of the rarest stamps um, in modern Canada. Okay, so paper fluorescence, I'll talk a little about that. That's a topic that, as far as I know, at least in England, I don't see any mention of it at all in the given specialized catalogs. Canada, we've our special. This is a core topic because we start out with typical doll paper that has no fluorescent quality in the 1950s and early 60s, and that was manufactured by the E.B. Eddy Company. Then, when we get into the modern printing with the lithograph stamps and with the very latest engraved stamps, um, we get a switch to fluorescent papers, some of which are extremely bright, which we call high bright. And then throughout the 70s and 80s, we have different paper suppliers. Um, and from the late 80s on, the paper suppliers actually identified in the corner of the sheets with an initial, so you can actually tell where the paper's coming from. And some of the issues exist on two or three different papers. There are some error papers where an issue that should exist on one paper is found on another, and it's quite rare. There's two or three rarities like that in the 1980s for Canada, um, where they're just fabulously rare. You know, a $1 stamp being worth over $1,000 on the right type of paper. So the fluorescence, the leading specialists in this area in the 1960s came up with a 12-point scale, where 0 is dead under long wave ultraviolet light, reflecting no light at all, and 12 is the brightest high bright. And so it goes from all the way from 0, 1 to 2 being dull, 3 to 4 being low fluorescent, 5 being fluorescent, just in the middle, 6 to 7 being medium, 8 to 9 being high, and 10 through 12 being high bright. I've got on my website, if you look in my stamp school, when you go into my booth, you'll see that I've got a whole section on fluorescent papers, and I've got illustrations taken under UV light where you can see some of the more extreme examples. It's hard to picture all that stuff with a camera, especially when you get into the lower grades. But there are some examples on my website. Um, so when you're studying this, one of the things you look at too is, and it gets very complicated, is ambient fluorescence versus fluorescent flex. So the paper can have an overall fluorescence level that appears a certain way, but then inside the paper, when you're looking at it, you can see brighter flecks in the paper pulp that are brighter than the actual overall fluorescence level. And so you can have, there are instances where you can have a paper that's, say, low fluorescent overall when you're looking at it, but one is all actually dead, but it contains fluorescent flecks that make the whole thing appear low. And then another paper can be low fluorescent on its own without any flecks at all. So even within a fluorescence level, there can be two or three different variations of how you get to that fluorescence level. So it gets really complicated. And I know I've studied it a little bit on Great Britain from the Wilding period, And when you folks get into the introduction of whiter papers in 1962 or 1958, that's where you start seeing fluorescent papers. And I've actually checked even well into the decimal period. You get different types of paper fluorescence on both the front of the stamp and the back. Um, and in the early 2000s, all of your paper becomes non-fluorescent, quite interestingly. And it does for Canada as well. So there's a whole period up through the 1990s where everything is all over the map, everything from dead to high bright. And then starting in the late 80s, everything goes back to being dull, um, with only a few variations poking out here and there. So then tagging and fluorescent coatings. Now, this would be the equivalent of phosphors in England, phosphor bans and all over phosphors and that sort of thing. So for Canada, we had in 1962 our first tagged stamps, which were phosphorescent tags. So they require to properly see them, you need shortwave light, and they glowed a bright blue, and they were first introduced on the Wilding issue, our Canadian Wilding issue, which is different from the English one. Um, and that tagging was used intermittently on various issues from Canada throughout the 60s. And it was right up until 1972. And then it was replaced by a fluorescent tagging called Ottawa tagging in 1972. And Ottawa tagging glows bright green or bright greenish yellow, and it's visible under normal shortwave or long wave UV light. So black light that you can buy at a hardware store will show it up, and it's safe to look at without any protection for your eyes. Um, for a little while in 1995 through 97, we had fluorescent coated paper, which would be the British equivalent of all over phosphor. But again, it was fluorescent, so you could see it under normal UV light. And that was for a little while in Canada. We had our stamps produced in Australia, and they were shipped back here. And so the Australian firm is the one that used the fluorescent coating. Um, and then after 1997, it was just gone, and back to Ottawa tagging. Um, so Winnipeg tagging, as I said, was phosphorescent. It was usually 2 bars on the side of the stamp, with the lower rate first class stamps having 1 bar in the center. Very similar to England, where you had your tagging on the sides and in the middle for the main rate stamps, and then you would have just a single band at the side or through the center of the stamp if it was an off rate stamp like a second or third class uh, rate. Um, and initially the Ottawa tagging was 2 bars down the side, but then starting in late 1985, it went to 4 bands all the way around the stamp design. And initially, when Ottawa tagging was first introduced, they had problems with the actual taggant migrating and moving from one stamp to another and through the stamps. And that's collectible to specialists in Canada, where we have the 2 different chemical compositions to the tagging. So talking a little bit about gum, um, the early Elizabethan issues in Canada up to 1971 are dextrin gum, which is the standard shiny uh, animal-based gum that a lot of countries have. I mean, in England, you call it gum arabic, which is a little different, but still the same general principle. Um, the gum, even within that category, there you'll see on Canadian stamps, there's different kinds of dextrin gum. There's smooth versus streaky. The level of sheen in the gum denotes differences in the chemical composition. So on some of the issues, you can collect different variations of that. Um, Starting in 1966 and 67, we had a very brief invisible davit gum that I alluded to earlier in the talk. And then in 1971, we got a synthetic gum, which we call spotty white gum. And it's almost a hybrid of PVA and dextrin. It appears on only a handful of stamps issued in 1971, and then it just disappears. And then PVA gum first appears in late 1971. And if you study Canadian stamps throughout the period, you'll see that there's a lot of variation in PVA gum. The gum of 1971 is completely different from the gum today. Although now we almost all our stamps are self-adhesive, and we have very, very few water gum activated stamps, sadly. But in England, I know the same thing. If you study the Mason series, or even if you look at the commemoratives, you'll see that the gum in the decimal period in 1971, it is very different from the gum in 1974, 75, and later. So, and there's in England, I know the Gibbons catalog has different listings um, for these gums, and on the, at least on the Mason head, some of them are very rare. There's combinations of phosphor and gum that are worth thousands and thousands of pounds for low value Mason heads. They're very, very rare, but they do exist, so they're out there to be found. Constant and tertiary varieties. So that's the next aspect of modern stamps. So whenever the plates are produced for the modern stamps, there are little uh, anomalies that arise in the design. Sometimes it's foreign matter getting onto the plate, or other causes that lead to little dots or scratches or um, donut flaws. But more often than not, it's dots and scratches and little figures in the design that don't belong there. And it usually occurs on one stamp in a sheet. Um, Prior to 1970 Christmas issue for Canada, stamp layouts were typically 4 or 6 or 100 subjects. Um, so the varieties in that time period are um, they're fairly easy to study because you you only had a limited number of sheets in the print layout. Once Ashton Potter, which was a private company, appears on the scene in 1971, the print layouts of the stamps changes dramatically. And a lot of the layouts are not fully known because the this was proprietary information from a private firm that didn't disclose it. So you could have an issue that was, say, 9 sheets arranged in a cross, and that was the print layout. And so what you find a lot of times is that the varieties that appear don't always appear on every single sheet. There are some very scarce flaws on some of the stamps from the early 70s that you'll see them in the catalog for $10 or $20, but you'll never find them. You could have 20 sheets and not find it on any sheet because it only occurs once in every 6 sheets. And just because you have 6 sheets doesn't mean you have the variety, because it's a game of probabilities. So it's really fascinating to get into, because when you're studying the different varieties, the ones that don't occur on every sheet, it gives you some clue into how many sheets must have been in the layout to produce the varieties. It's a little difficult to explain, but that's the general gist of collecting and the significance of collecting modern flaws, um, is trying to decipher those different print layouts. The best example, or the most extreme example, of flaws and constant flaws is the 1970 Christmas issue, in which specialists have identified over 1,000 constant varieties. Now, most of those are extremely small and extremely minor. I myself, when Christmas rolls around and I happen to have a number of the 1970 sheets, I will sometimes offer um, variations where I have 10 of each, uh, 10 varieties of each stamp, and I'll pick the top 10. I've never offered all 1,000. I mean, that's just beyond the scope for me. But there's some there that are quite significant and very popular with collectors. And then 1972, we had an issue with Cornelius Krieghoff, with his painting, and there's over 30 constant varieties on that issue spread out over 6 panes. Um, and some of them are only found in one position out of the 6 panes, so one in every 300 stamps. Um, and they're quite hard to find, especially for the tagged stamps. Um, so, that was a popular area when the stamp came out, and then it sort of faded into obscurity for a while. But there are people that are now starting to revive it and are starting to seriously collect and seek out these varieties. A lot of them are very hard to find in positional blocks now because a lot of the sheets have been broken up. So, trying to find positional multiples that show the varieties along with the normal stamps is a lot harder than you would think, especially when they don't occur in the corner block positions.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. Subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss out.
Okay, so moving on to postal history, we have, at least in Canada since 1982, we have annual rate increases starting in 1982. And the Setennan issues are such that a block or a pair does not usually correspond to a particular first class rate, which makes in period use on cover a scarcity. Most of the time, you're only going to find it on registered covers. And it'll only occur where the person at the post office just happened to have those stamps and didn't have the higher value definitive available to cover the rate. Some rates in Canada are very short lived. Early 1979, just before we went metric, we had a short period where we had the rate went up by 2 cents, and it was only in effect for about 3 or 4 months. Late 1976 to early 77, same thing, where it went from 10 to 12 cents in less than 6 months. All of the other rates, the special delivery, the registered, they all went up in step. And finding those particular rate covers is challenging. And like I said before, to get all of the Setennants and souvenir sheets for Canada on cover, I think would be a real challenge. And I would imagine it would be exactly the same for England as well, starting in 1980 with the London 1980 sheets. Tremendously difficult, I think. Perforation varieties. Now, for England, I'm not aware of two. I think you folks had more or less the same perforation on all your stamps for the longest time. Canada was similar. We had 12 as our standard perf until 1974. And then we get 13.3, which becomes a common perf all the way, all the way into the 1990s. But there have been some specialists that have found, even within these basic perfs, there are variations caused by different machines. Like with 12, there in 1962, we find that there's 12, 11.95, 12.15, 11.85 um, measurements, and those represent, we think, different machines, different perforating machines that were used. And between 1962 and the end of line perforating in 1971, we see all the different compounds of those numbers as well. And if you study the issues from 1962 to 71, you'll see different instances of these compounds. So that's a whole area of study that only just was discovered and drawn attention to in about the last 6 or 7 years. It's been under everybody's nose the whole time, but nobody ever thought to check the perf 12s with an instanta gauge to see if they actually were 12, um, or not. And when you start looking at these things, you find uh, differences that are consistent, and call into question what the significance of those differences are. So after 1971, our perforating switches from line to comb and becomes much more consistent. There aren't those kinds of variations that I'm pointing out after, but the post office does have a whole period um, in the 1980s where they switch the actual perforations um, completely on some printings of the definitives, and some of them are extremely rare. The another variation you can find on perforating um, with modern issues has to do with the way the actual perfs are laid out on the sheet. So where they are on the selvage. You'll notice when you see some sheets of stamps that the perfs will stop right at the edge of the stamps and will not go into the selvage. The selvage will be imperforate. On other issues, you'll see a single hole extending beyond the row or the column of stamps, and that's what we call one extension hole. And then on others, you'll see the perforations go all the way through the selvage. Um, on most issues, it's going to be one or the other, but there are, especially in Great Britain, this is one area where you guys will have more of this than Canada. Um, you'll have all three types on many of the Mason heads and many of the commemoratives. And some of your perforation configurations are much scarcer than others, and they're usually collected on cylinder blocks. But they're that's a very fertile area for a GB specialist. So there, I talked about the 1988 mammals set, which had the changes. Okay, so I've gone over all the major areas of interest. Now, what do we need to actually be a modern specialist? Um, well, we need a good ultraviolet light. Um, One with a dual short and long wave is ideal, but even if you can't get that, because those are fairly expensive, a good 18-inch black light available in Canada. We have Canadian Tire, but in England, I guess it would be Marks and Spencer or whichever store sells housewares, main store selling housewares. It would just be a black light used for parties. They're usually about 18 inches long, and they give out a good um, amount of light. So you can use them even in a lit room if you're careful. You'll need a good instanta perf gauge, which can measure to up to 0.05 of a perf, and a good 10 power loop for spotting plate flaws. Okay, so decisions in making a form and forming a collection. So you've got to make some decisions if you're going to embark and you decide you're going to go all in on modern stamps from a particular country. So you've got decisions as to scope. Um, so which part of the Elizabethan period do you want to cover? You want to cover it all, or do you want to pick a specific time period? For England, you guys have the decimal versus pre-decimal period to break it up, and then within each period, you can break that up further. Or you can decide, okay, I'm going to do just commemoratives or one of the definitive sets. Then you have to make some decisions as to format. Do you want singles only? Do you want to collect cylinder or plate blocks? Do you want to have any first day covers in your collection? Are you going to include regular postal history or just pick up a few? Then you've got to make some decisions on the degree of detail that you want to have in there. Do you want just the basic issues, or do you want to have all the variations and errors? Do you want to get into fluorescence at all, or do you want to ignore it? And then closed versus open-ended collecting. Do you want to have all of your items defined ahead of time and to make up pages and have spaces for only those items? Or do you want to collect in a more fluid fashion where you're open-ended and you're adding things as they come up? So I give an example here. If I was to decide to collect modern Canada, how I would scope it out. So for scope, I'd collect the whole period from 1952 until her death. My singles would focus on every variety I could find as a single, collected in a very open-ended manner. And that would be one collection. Okay, plate blocks up to 1956, I do just the lower left corner because it has the full inscription and the full print order number. Afterwards, I wouldn't even collect blocks. I would just do pairs because I can get the full inscription on a pair. And I wouldn't care what position it was from. It could be any of the four positions. First day covers, one of each first day cover would be fine. It can be any cachet, any configuration. I just would want one representative cover for each issue. I'm not forming a specialized first day cover collection. I don't need more than one. Postal history, I would try to get one commercial in period usage of each issue. Destination and specific rate would not be important, as again, I'm not trying to form a specialized cover collection. Cancellations on used stamps, I'd try to get a page of cancels from as many towns as I could find. In my album, I'd make up a facing page with a couple of picture postcards of that town, maybe a small write-up of 1 to 2 paragraphs about the town, and then the right page, I might pick 6 to 10 stamps with cancels of that town, and they can be any issues. So I'm not trying to get each town on every issue of Canada from that period. Just a handful of stamps to illustrate will do. I wouldn't include any errors like inverted centers or imperfs, as I'm only interested in what a collector could have bought over the counter. So it has to, my rule here is it has to exist used. And then in conclusion, that sample collection I just gave you, that would take a lifetime to form, even with what I've laid out and with the restrictions I've put in there. There's nothing in there that's over $1,000. 99% of it will be affordable to everybody listening to this. And it's fully open-ended, and that each section could be expanded as I find more material I want or like.
There are more virtual Stampex talks coming to YouTube. You know what to do. Click subscribe now so you don't miss out. See you soon. We hope to see you at our next Stampex show, at Virtual Stampex or in person in London.